Socrates had the white pieces and opted for an open Sicilian against deep blue with long castling. And after bishop to f4, there's no pawn fork here, because after e5, white can save the knight with knight takes c6. You're counter-attacking the queen, so you have to take the knight, and now you see that black's d6 pawn is pinned, so white has bishop takes e5. So instead of that, black opted for bishop to d7, but still, knight takes c6 anyway. And the point here is that you're unleashing a discovered attack on the d6 pawn. So the only way to save it is bishop to c6, counter-attacking e4. And by the time Socrates consolidates this pawn, black will be just in the nick of time to save it with d5. Now we see queen to e1 from Socrates, which is a strong move because now you're pinning the d-pawn to the queen, and white's queen, despite being on the first rank, is very powerful because she can go up to h4 for a potential kingside attack. And also, when this e-pawn makes a trade at some point, the e-file will be open and potentially useful. Deep blue then decided to go bishop b4 here to pin white's knight to the queen and soften white's control over the d5 pawn. And as a bonus, since this bishop is rather annoying, it provokes some weaknesses in white's camp, like a3. Deep blue already knows it's going to castle kingside, and in the resulting opposite side castling position, you want to have hooks like a3, which serve as anchor points for your pawns to make contact with the enemy pawns, so that you can tear open white's king position. Anyway, after a few more moves, we see the real battle taking place. White slowly gets their pieces over to the king side and potentially prepares a bishop h6 sacrifice. On the other hand, black has superior center control thanks to the d5 pawn. So black decided to drive this pawn up with d4. And Socrates played knight to a2. Now modern day Stockfish seems to have no problem with this move, but it makes no sense to choose knight to a2 considering that you have knight to e2 instead. The difference here is that you're putting a lot of pressure on the d4 pawn, so it forces black to defend it with bishop b6. This is an isolated pawn, there are no fellow pawns that can help out, so you need one entire piece, one entire bishop to babysit this guy. And this doesn't just keep black passive, it avoids a dark square bishop trade, so that white now can consider sacrificing on h6. And the final point of course is that this knight is closer to the king side and can circle around for a stronger attack. So it's strange that white didn't opt for knight to e2, and it's even stranger that Stockfish doesn't point out any issue with knight to a2. In any case, without any pressure on d4, deep blue could afford to trade bishops, and one of the points of the bishop trade is that not only are you avoiding any sacrifices on h6, you can also vacate the a5 square for the pawn. And now you're completely trapping white's knight in. White then played bishop to c4, which is a very short-sighted materialistic move, trying to go for the d4 pawn directly. And if you look at games played by the engines in the 1990s, like Deep Blue or Socrates, a lot of their mistakes stem from materialism because engines don't really weight positional elements very heavily or precisely. Traditional engines, that is. And there are many reasons why bishop to c4 is not a good move. It's not doing anything, it's inviting black to expand on the queen side, and this neglects completing development. This h1 rook will be much happier on d1, not just because it will be an open foul, but because this bishop on c4 would like to have f1 as a retreating square, without worrying about trapping this rook in. So I'll show you how the game continues, and the more moves that we play on, the more you will realize why white's position isn't so good now. Deep blue indeed went for b5, and after rook takes d4 and queen to e7, white will love to play bishop to d3. But bishop d3 fails tactically because black has queen to e3 check, forking the king and the rook. The rook would love to save itself with rook to d2, but now this bishop is in the way. And you can see the real tactical problem after white's forced move, king to b1. And this rook has one attacker and exactly one defender. And so we chase this defender away with pawn to g5. If you take on h6, I take the whole rook and I conveniently defend this knight. Otherwise, the only other move available is rook to g4, pinning this pawn to the king, but that means you give up an exchange. And so all this is to say that white cannot go bishop to d3 and has to go bishop f1, having two pieces stuck at home in the height of an opposite castling battle. So if you go back a few moves to see what white could have done better, rook h d1 is clearly a far superior move because the d4 pawn is yours anyway. There is no rush. One of the things that engines in the 90s couldn't really understand, you know, much like primal humans looking for immediate gratification at all times. These older chess engines would harm their position to hunt pawns that already belong to them. There's no way that black can defend this pawn. And now to show you the value of this rook move, I will show a variation making the gameplay as similar as possible to the real game. Let's just say black continued with rook to c8, a reasonable move. And then the game continues in similar fashion with bishop c4, b5, and rook takes. Let's just say the exact same thing happens. The key difference here is that bishop f1 is available. Contrast that with the actual game, where now white's rook is trapped. So while white's pieces are uncoordinated, Deep Blue took the chance to let the queen invade on e3. And Socrates decided to block this check with the rook. And normally you don't want to walk into a pin, but here it is encouraged for two reasons. The first is that any attempt to pressure the rook by playing rook to d8 can be shielded with bishop to d3. And the second reason you want to move the rook away from d4 is that if you leave this rook here, then the queen is tactically tied down to its defense, and we've already seen these kind of tactics with g5. That's the main problem. If white had played king to b1, then there's g5, and white is losing the rook again. And the last point on why rook to d2 is a great move is that it vacates the d4 square so that white's queen can return and hopefully find some coordination. With that anyway, Deep Blue continued the attack with pawn to b4. And there really isn't a way to hold on to material here. If a4, obviously bishop takes a4. And if you try to keep your material by taking on b4, then you're just asking for it, because now this rook has the open file and is attacking this unprotected knight. And so now the king is kind of busy covering the rook and the knight, and back rank checkmate. So that means white has to use their bishop to join the game. But now we can try to deflect the bishop with bishop to d5, attacking the sole defender of this a2 knight. And the only way white could add a defender is by trading bishops and then bringing the queen to c4. But now we can deflect the queen with knight to b6. And now every single square that the queen can use to stay in touch with this knight is controlled. If queen to b3, we have a simple trade and we take the a2 knight. So the concrete calculation confirms it. White has no way of preserving material after b4. And so instead, you may as well try to trade queens and get it over with. So Deep Blue took the pawn back and got into this endgame. And although material is equal, black will be a little bit better. And the way that you can evaluate this is by understanding 5 factors involved in evaluation. And they are as follows: material, king safety, piece activity, center control, and finally pawn structure. And in that order. So go through them one at a time. First, material, it's equal. For king safety, white is the one that should be slightly more concerned. It's not that they will be checkmated, but with the king exposed like that, they are more prone to tactics, pins, and getting tied up in knots. There are so many open lines towards white's king position. The third one, piece activity. Black is clearly superior. This rook is strong, this bishop is strong, and this knight is just a few moves away from getting into the action, as is this rook. Whereas white still has this residual problem from earlier, from bishop f1 trapping these two pieces in. The fourth factor is center control, which is determined by how many pawns you have in the center. In this case, neither side has any meaningful center control, so that is equal. And the last one, pawn structure, favors black slightly, because black has the outside pass pawn, which is harder to catch compared to white's central pass pawn. So overall, we can say that black has a slight to moderate advantage. So let's continue with the game now. White tried to get active with the rook, but then here comes a check. And this is one instance where you can see how having the outside pass pawn is so valuable. Because now white is in a dilemma. Do you want to sit in front of the pawn, but then potentially get checkmated? Or would you want to sit on the opposite side of the river, that is this rook controlling the b file, and then watch this pawn sail past you? Now obviously Socrates opted for king to c1 to not lose material, and here Deep Blue went for a piece trade. And the reason this piece trade, bishop for knight, is so powerful is that you don't give white time to breathe. The moment you do something calm is if instead of rook to a3, you went bishop to e8. This gives white time to consolidate their position, develop, and potentially equalize. So in contrast, you want to go for rook to a3 and force white into urgency. Do not give them time to get these pieces out. And with this rook on the other side of the board, after the piece trade, Socrates cannot simply bring his bishop outside because of this skewer, which means that Socrates has to slowly untangle itself with a fianchetto with g3 and then bishop to g2. But here comes a point where Deep Blue was able to finish the game, and I'd like you to pause the video and try to find this yourself. Now I'll give you the solution. You start off with a rook check, and here the clear target is this f1 bishop, which has 1 attacker and 1 defender, and this rook behind it, which has 0 attackers and 0 defenders. So the most tempting move to play here is rook b to b1. If having one rook on the last rank is good, then having two rooks is awesome, because now you have double pin on this rook and double attack on this bishop. So the question for white now is that can they move this bishop away with some threat that is bigger than this rook? And the only threat bigger than a rook is a king. So that's when it's not too difficult to find out that white will have rook to c8 check, forcing black to the h7 square. Now it's on a light square that is exposed, and white can go bishop to d3, untangling themselves with check. And after black blocks the check and this rook trade, white is actually doing better here because they have rook to c7, attacking f7, and then bishop c4, and this f7 pawn will fall. So that means rook b to b1. So that means rook b to b1 does not work. But that doesn't mean that you should give up on tactics, and I'm about to share with you a powerful calculation technique that chess masters use, and you'll want to make this a habit. That is, when you find an idea that is good, like rook to b1, but it doesn't work because of a particular resource, you should not discard the idea, but instead find the reason that it doesn't work, and that is bishop d3. And then next, you find new candidate moves that attempt the exact same idea without allowing white's defensive resource. And when we think about it from that perspective, we are brought to the answer rook to d8 check. And the point is that we are going to use the d1 square instead of the b1 square. Because with our rook on d1, we control the bishop landing on d3 in the future. Concretely speaking, it comes with two differences. The first is if you play king to e2. If you play king e2, it's simple. We pin your bishop, and obviously, after the check, your king blocks your own bishop, so there is no untangling tactic in this position. White needs to spend an extra move to free their bishop, but that gives black time to block the diagonal, so that bishop d3 no longer comes with check. Now you might be thinking, what if instead, white simply moves their king to a square that doesn't block this bishop? Now the only other two squares are e3 or c3. They are both on the third rank. And you're going to see the critical problem with this. Let's say king to e3. Still rook to d1. And after check and king to h7, you realize that there's no bishop to d3 check. And that's because of rook takes d3. Because the king is on the third rank, again, whether e3 or c3 will be the same thing, you can now take this bishop with check. So white is forced to take the d3 rook, and then you take on h1, and you're up a piece. So again, going back a few moves, it comes down to the same problem as before, that white is simply one tempo short. They need an extra tempo to get off the third rank so that bishop d3 cannot be taken with check. But again, that gives black time to go g6, and bishop d3 no longer comes with check. Now surprisingly, despite how concrete this line is, Deep Blue didn't actually find this idea and went a4 instead, which is probably still winning, but it's not a slam dunk anymore. This gives Socrates time to untie their pieces with bishop g2. We have a check, and then a very strange decision from Socrates, king to e2, which moves away from this pass pawn. And that spells trouble, because if there's a pass pawn, you at least want to respect it and bring your king closer to potentially catch it. But now, because of king to e2, Deep Blue's job is very easy. Trade rooks and start pushing. White's king is way too far away from the a1 square to stop promotion, so instead, white has to use the rook. So Deep Blue prevented it with knight to d5. You can't go to b1 because I'm going to land on c3 with a fork. So white played rook to d6 instead. But now both the rook and the king, and needless to say this bishop, all do not have access to a1 within the next few moves. So black immediately went knight c3 and just made a run for it. And normally, this sort of endgame, where white has a pawn and a bishop against a rook, may be a bit inconvenient to win, but in this case, black has a concrete idea, exploiting the fact that white's king is way too far away. And that is, eventually, black is going to be able to hunt down one of these pawns. And that makes the task simple, because now, it's a 3-on-2 majority on the king's side. So I'll show you the rest of the game very quickly. Deep Blue converted this majority to an extra pass pawn, an outside pass pawn no less, and gradually pushed it forward, exploiting the fact that this rook cannot be taken because of promotion. So white had to stop it. But now the rook simply waits on the g-file, and recognizing that white cannot make progress, black can slowly saunter their king out and collect these pawns. And eventually, white recognized that there's no stopping this plan, whether it's to pick up this pawn or that pawn, and so resign here. So that's it for this game. Trust you learned something and consider subscribing for more videos like this.